All right, good afternoon. I'm Christina with Fort Bend County Libraries. Thank you so much for coming today to our workshop, Successful Home Composting, part of the Landscape Success Series with Fort Bend Master Gardeners and with AgriLife Extension. Today we are with Fort Bend Master Gardener Ed Plant. Now, Ed has been a master gardener since 2001 and has earned specializations in many areas. He is certified in rainwater harvesting, citrus, plant propagation, entomology, and is a master composter. He is also a Texas Master Naturalist of the Coastal Prairie Chapter since 2004. And now I pass you over to his capable hands.
Hey, well, thank you very much. Nothing else I want to say about myself other than through the years, I learned a lot, and I even learn a lot in these programs. So if you have something, put it in the chat room and then we'll discuss it. I have no problem with that. Today, this is what we're going to be going over. We're going to be going over soil concepts, composting, and vermicomposting. The reason I put in soil concepts to this is because you could make all the compost you want, but if you're putting it on your soil and your soil has other problems, then compost may not help. So let's talk about soil first. And it's pretty straightforward. You know, the soil is where the water and the where the plants get their water and nutrients, and it provides an anchor for the plant. Now, that seems pretty basic, so let's go a little further into it. The soil consists of weathered geological materials. That's stuff that's washed down from the mountains or wherever and comes down our rivers. And that could be our sands and things like that. Composting decaying remains of plants. You know, the forest floor is the best place in Mother Nature to know what compost is, because all this stuff kind of falls to the ground or dies and then is composted. Air and water. Now, what I want you to notice is air and water will come into my talk several times during this presentation. And microorganisms. Everything does not compost without a microorganism, because those microorganisms are what cause compost to be made in a timely manner. And I'll talk about one of those later on. You know, if you live in this area, you know gumbo and you know clay. And if you're lucky or unlucky enough to live near the river or a creek or whatever, you'll know sand. So what we're going to talk about now is the four basic mineral particles of the coarser ones are the sands. Most of y'all have felt sand. A silt is the finest part of it's fine, and it feels smooth.
Ed, I think you need to unmute yourself. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, now I'm unmuted.
Yeah,
How
thank
long
you.
have I been unmuted?
Just,
How long have I?
just a few seconds.
Okay, so in the previous screen, we saw sand and silt. In this screen, we see a clay, which makes up a lot of our gumbo. And what we strive for is a loam, which is all these put together. Now, why am I telling y'all about this? Because there is a soil texture triangle that kind of defines this. If something's high in clays, that's the peak of the triangle. And if it's high in sands, that's on the left. And if it's high in silts, it's to the right. And if you have a loam, it's a little bit of all of them. That's that area that says loam. Now, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you a clay loam, and I'll tell you why here in a second. But the way that graph works is the clays get higher, or the sands get higher, or the silts get higher. That's where you get the different percentages in how you kind of classify something. Either on the sand side, it's a sand, loamy sand, a sandy loam. And as you move up, move away from that, then you could probably figure that out. So that's what I wanted to tell y'all. There's a triangle that kind of says what percentages of clays, silts, and sands. Now, I just got another annotation request, so hold on. Last time I did that, okay. So this screen is up here because of what we just talked about. They did a survey of all the soils of the whole US, and the USDA did it, and it's part of NRCS. And I went in here and I said, start the WWS. And then I said, look at Texas. And I think I said, look at Fort Bend. And then once I was in Fort Bend, I found where my house is going to be. Right now, I live in Sugar Land, but I will be living in Rosenberg, ETJ. Now, this is the subdivision where I will be moving. And if you see those kind of, that's what color lines you see there, but it actually, when I look at that, I'm in a Bernard clay, which is a BB. And that Bernard clay loam tells me, because of that previous deal, that it's clay, but it still has some silt and sand in it. So you could look up what, you don't look it up by address. You basically find yourself on the map. And then you could see what the soil, at least according to the survey, was. Now, when a builder builds a house, of course, they change that. They put down the sand and they put down the grass. And, but underneath all that, you should have, underneath the house where I'm moving to, is a Bernard clay loam. Now, the county used to do these maps, but I couldn't find the map when I looked on it recently. So, we talked earlier about the soil and what it does. It has a structure, and that structure allows air and water movement And the reason that's important is the clays hold the water for a long time, and the sands allow the water to percolate rather quickly through. So that's why you want a loam, because it allows the roots to grow down in there, and the water and air will follow the roots as they go down into the ground. Good, and just like it says here, good soil structure is it's good for root, and a poor structure can discourage root development. We're getting closer to talking about composting. And composting is really just things degrading, decomposition, and here's a simple drawing of it. Leaves falling, worms and stuff eating it, nutrients traveling up to the plants. So just a simple picture of decomposition in the forest. The soil food web is what animals and what bacteria and fungi and things like that break down the organic matter, and how it goes, just like a food web, a food deal, it goes up through the web and makes it to us. So bacteria and fungi and nematodes are all part of that. The one that, when I took my original composting class, is called an actinomycetes, and it is just a composting little fool. I mean, it lives to compost, and that's one of the ones that when you build a compost pile correctly, that's the one that's going to go in there and start making compost for you. And I want to talk about how to build that compost pile so you could be successful with your compost. And even if you're not successful, I will give you some thoughts on how to be more successful. I've already said some of this. They decompose organic compounds, they store and release nutrients, they degrade pollutants, and that's an important one. Not that they're going to clean everything out of it, but they're part of nature's way of filtering out and getting rid of pollutants that get in our soil. And as I said earlier, those roots going through the soil need somewhere to go, and it creates a way for water to get down through the soil, and these soil organisms help eat things and decompose things to allow water to go back into our water tables instead of running off into our sewers, and then our creeks and rivers, and then our bays and oceans. And this one, I don't know that I know much about, but it was in some of the write-ups. So I'm saying that these soil organisms can also knock back some of the crop pests, and that's it. So here we're getting into the meat of compost. You need to add organic matter, and that encourages the microbial activity. Those are actinomycetes and the bacterias and the fungi and the things like that. I'm going to say a word here about earthworms, but this is a word just about earthworms in general. It isn't about the final topic I'm going to talk about, which is the vermicomposting. This is about just general earthworms. But they're in our soil. I always like it when I'm digging and find an earthworm. And their poop, which is called cast, is really good soil additive. I'll tell you why I use that word in a minute. But their cast, their poop, is good for everything in the soil, I'll say. Charles Darwin said this: all fertile areas of this planet have at least once passed through the bodies of earthworms. So they've been doing this a long time, making a lot of fertile areas on our planet. So that's all I'm going to say about earthworms now, except be happy when you see them in your garden. If you don't see them in your garden, try to think of why they're not there. Are you using too many synthetic things, or are you using too many chemicals that affect the worms? So worms are a good thing. Okay, I've talked about soil, talked about some microorganisms. Here's my little pitch for soil sampling. The master gardeners and extension offices and things like that should have information of how to do soil sampling. You could also check out the website here, which is the soil testing laboratory at A&M. That's soiltesting.tamu.edu. I'm going to put a little pitch in here for tamu.edu. Most of what I talk about in any Master Gardener presentation is researched and written up by universities such as Texas A&M University. And I suggest that being the first place you do a Google search when you're looking for something to do with growing something. And the way I do that is when I get in a Google search, and let's say I was Googling composting, I would type in TAMU space compost and see what comes up. Because those sites will usually have tamu.edu in them, and those are what we feel as master gardeners give a good research behind what they put out. Now we're getting to compost, and everybody has their own reason. I'm going to say that we're living in an area where things are being urbanized. You know, the city is moving out farther and farther. I will say that especially for Rosenberg, because I've lived in Houston, Rosenberg, and Sugar Land for 60 years now. So I've seen the urbanization in each of those places. And gardeners, hopefully, if you're here as a gardener to learn something, you're hopefully will be a good land steward. And here's my little pitch about organic versus synthetic. I used to be a Scots person, and it could be any name there, but everything I used to put on my yard was synthetic. Slowly through the years, I have changed over to more organic ways of doing things. And periodically, if there's a problem I can't solve, I go with synthetics. But for the most part, I try to, and I'm not saying organic as in I only use organic things. No, I try to use compost because I know that either came from my yard or came from a composter that I trust. So the alternate is trashing it. At one time, a person with the city of Sugar Land told me at peak times of the summer, half of a trash truck is green yard waste. I know that sort of changed because now living in Sugar Land as I do, I have regular trash, I have recycling, and I have yard waste that is picked up separately. So that's great. I like that. I said earlier that I would talk about nutrient-rich soil additive, and that's where composting comes in. Composting is the controlled decomposition of organic waste and yard trimmings, resulting in a nutrient-rich soil additive that is not a fertilizer. Fertilizers, for the most part, are synthetic or manufactured, and they could have the nutrients you need, but compost is an additive. And that will become more, you'll understand that more when you see some of the uses for compost later on. And compost is recycling. Some of the benefits go back to the soil. We've saw these earlier: plant nutrients, soil structure, beneficial soil life, soil and water retention, and manages solid waste. And I used to have to tell, when I did have a yard person doing my yard, not to bag it and put it out on the curb, but to hopefully have a good enough mulching lawnmower to put it back in the yard. Here is the pieces of the ingredients of compost. There's basically 4 of them. It's not hard to remember. And you'll recognize a couple of them in a minute. Carbon and nitrogen. Well, where do we get carbon and nitrogen? Carbon is the brown materials that provide energy. A piece of grass, when it's cut and green, is not carbon. It's the next one, nitrogen. But that piece of grass, if it lays out there, or that leaf that lays out there, or whatever it is that turns brown, the chlorophylls out of it, that's the carbon. And the nitrogen is the green. For the most part, it's green. It could be coffee grounds, that's nitrogen also. But for the most part, green materials provide the food. Now here's a number that 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen. So you want 30 carbons to 1 nitrogen. But the important thing here is equal by weight. How many of you, and I'm not asking you to raise your hands or anything, but think to yourself, how many of you have picked up a bag of dry leaves that are brown, carbon, and they're fairly light, versus picking up I'll say wet, doesn't even have to be wet, but a bag of fresh mowed grass that you wrap up and put in the bag? They are pretty heavy. So when you build a compost bin, you want a 30 to 1 ratio or equal by weight. that means that small bag of green may be the same weight as 6 bags of oak leaves or pecan leaves or whatever. And that's the important part, to make it easy, equal by weight. The other two pieces of these ingredients going into compost is air and moisture. Now, if you remember that, air and water were mentioned several slides back as being part of what's in the soil. So we're basically mimicking what's in the soil so these actinomycetes and other decomposers can move around and make good compost. Aerobic activity, if you remember, aerobics meaning you're working out your airway and your lungs and things like that. That's what oxygen does. The moisture encourages bacterial and microorganism growth. These decomposers, these little bitty decomposers, need that water to move around the compost and eat your compost. I mean, eat your leaves and things to make compost. Now, if you have too much water, which I'm going to say, if you follow the way I build a pile, I've never had a pile have too much water, and I'll explain that more in a little bit. But if you built your pile in a soggy area and water couldn't get out, then you're going to have anaerobic. Anaerobic is also fermentation. If something's fermenting, it's going to have a sour smell, and that isn't what we want in our kind of composting. It may be what you want when you're making kombucha or something like that to drink, but not, or other fermented drinks, but not in your compost pile. Too much oxygen dries out the pile. That comes into effect with the size of the pile and what the pile is made of. And I'll explain a little bit more on that later. Particle size. If you threw a big limb, you'll see an example of this later on. But if you see a big limb in a compost pile, that's going to take a long time to compost. So the smaller, the better. The way I do it is I use a lawnmower to actually mow the grass and make the green, and to run over the leaves to make the brown, and to chop up the twigs. Yes, I do have to make sure no kids or no other family members can be aimed at by my mower when I do this, because sometimes it can kick out a twig. Now, of course, I don't run over big twigs or logs. If you're doing kitchen scraps, they say a blender. I just use a knife for my kitchen scraps. And I don't have a chipper, but I have used a chipper to chip up branches. I guess that's the best of all worlds. If you had a shredder, a chipper, and a lawnmower, you could do almost anything compost wise. This is one I use sparingly. I use pruners when I'm pruning back my rose plants or pruning back any plant. What I do usually is take that limb or whatever it is, and I walk over to my compost bin and I kind of chop it up, trying to get it, I'm going to say, the size of my thumbnail. That's the best world, something small. Now, there's two basic types of composting. It has to do with the temperature, not outside, not whether it's sunny or cold or hot, or actually doesn't have to do with it's wet or dry, but it has to do with the compost itself. Cold composting can take, actually, it's going to say a little while, 6 months. I'll go over that in a second. It's going to take, that's where I'll explain it more, but cold composting is just putting stuff out there, and hot composting is faster, but requires your time and attention. When I am not hot composting and my pile is just sitting there, it is cold composting. So it is still composting, but it's cold composting. It's not a bad thing. It just means that I haven't gotten out there to attend to that pile. Cold composting, you just add it and you have patience, and you harvest from the bottom and inside of the pile. That's because at the bottom and inside of the pile are going to be the best conditions. Composters, the micro whatevers, have the best conditions for them to do their work, but it just takes time. The advantages, I guess, just like this person under the umbrella, it's easy and carefree. If you don't care how long it takes for compost, then you don't have to do any maintenance on it. And it requires, to me, when I'm not hot composting, it's cold composting. So it's the same amount of space for me. The disadvantages, it could take 6 months to several years for something to get composted. 6 months is what I've heard. I usually don't leave my piles for that long, so I haven't tested that theory, but that's what I understand. It does not reach a high enough temperature to kill weed seeds or pathogens. If I'm mowing my yard for the first time of the season and I have weed seeds that have come up in my yard, I bag it and send it to the curb. That's one of the few times I do bag what that I do want it bagged, because I don't want to put weed seeds in my compost pile. And I'll go into something about that in a minute also. Pathogens, if you have a sick plant, the same thing. Pull that plant, put it in a bag, and put it in your trash and put it on the curb. They don't decompose uniformly. You know, I told you the center bottom is where they decompose and make compost. Now, when I think of successful composting in a timely manner, that is hot composting. I've had piles ready in 4 to 5 weeks. 4 weeks is about the fastest. They require your labor. I didn't say your here, but they require labor to control the moisture and aeration, and that's turning the pile. That's kind of a composting term, turning the pile. It could reach temperatures of 160 degrees. That's when you're killing bad things that are in your compost. That's when it's getting rid of the pollutants. It's getting, rid of most of the weed seeds. The first pile I ever built, the first day it got up, the next day after I built it, I went out there, it had gotten up to 135 degrees. And for most part, that's about what most of my piles get to, a little bit above that, but not usually up to 160. It kills most weed seeds and pathogens, but not nutgrass. If you have nutgrass, you're just going to have to make sure you pull that nut out when you pull the grass, or you do whatever you do for nutgrass. In other words, haven't been up to that on that for a while, but covering it and doing solar heating of it and things like that. I'll leave that up to you how to get rid of. And you could call the Master Gardener's helpline for how to get rid of nutgrass. To build a pile, it all comes down to this. Once you have collected your carbon, your brown, carbon and browns can be stored in bags since they're dry and they're not wet. They could be stored in plastic bags, they could be stored in trash cans. You don't have to get rid of those after a certain amount of time. They could be stored for the next time you build a pile. The nitrogens, the green stuff, if you tried to store a nitrogen green bag of something, you're going to get fermentation. And that's when it smells sour or whatever. So choose a well-drained location. That means if you got a bog in the back of your yard, I wouldn't build it in the bog. I wouldn't build it under a tree where roots will literally try to grow up, because you're making compost and trees love compost. And try to put your pile where you could move around it. When I put my pile out, I make sure that my lawnmower can go around the pile, because your greenest grass in your yard and your best growing tomato seed is going to grow at the edge of your compost pile. And I usually try to leave the tomato seed in the tomato plant and get my next tomatoes off of it. But it's going to be great growing place for good and bad. So I'm going to show you in a minute what my compost bin looks like, and I'll give you some thoughts of how I do it. But basically, whatever you choose, whether it's a pile, a compost bin, whatever it is, you add, I say, a 6-inch layer of brown, meaning carbon, and then a 3-inch layer of green materials, usually grass. Mine is usually oak leaves and yard trimmings. When I lived in Rosenberg and my wife worked at Jane Long Elementary, the lady across the street from Jane Long Elementary, who also volunteered at the school and I knew, she was raking her leaves and she was about 80% done. And I went and asked her if I could have her bags of leaves. She said yes, but next year come and do the raking. So I don't think I got them from her the next year. So you do a 6-inch, a 3-inch, and then you water it. You water the whole layer and you mix it. You don't just put down because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get water on every leaf. And if you've ever had just a pile of leaves in your yard and it rains and you go out there and dig in the leaves, it's dry a few leaves down. So what you're trying to do is mix the water in each of these layers of 6-inch and 3-inch and water. So it's 6-inch, 3-inch water mix, 6-inch, 3-inch water mix. And you repeat it until you get at least 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot. And you're going, Ed, why 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot? That goes back to university studies in universities like Texas A&M around the United States that did these studies on how big your particle size needs to be in your compost pile, how big your compost pile had to be. And what they came up with is at 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot, it has enough brown, green, water, and air to make compost efficiently. I usually don't cover my piles, but if you have a problem with animals getting in your pile, such as a cat or something like that, you could put a tarp over your pile. The tarp itself does not really change the composting itself. This picture, this Word document I made when I was doing a kids camp for master gardeners. And basically I made this, and you'll see something here in a minute to go with it. But it was basically for those children to take back to their parents to make their parents a better composter if they chose to try this with their kids. This is just a little bit less wordy, but it says the same thing. I told you earlier I would talk about my compost bin. This is my compost bin. Since I'm moving, I don't have compost working or a garden working. I've been weeding my garden. So some of the things I wanted to tell y'all about this. First of all, I said 6-inch, 3-inch water mix. 6-inch, 3-inch water mix until it gets up to 3 foot by 3 foot. This bin folds down to where it's rather small. It's made with strong enough rubber coated wire. It's made by the Shepherd Company in Houston. I don't know if they still make those or not. But it is over 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot. It's pretty close to 4 foot by 4 foot by 3 foot. But it came with a piece of this shepherd's wire made into a rectangle that came up. It came with a deal that goes in the middle to allow oxygen to get to the middle. Now, what I found was I usually make it 3 foot tall, so it's all about the same. The yellow yardstick there is my reminder to you to make a 3 foot by 3 foot pile. At the end of that yardstick, you'll see a small kitchen thermometer. That's the way I measured the temperature in my pile when I first started. Now, if you see something wrapped around that red case for the thermometer, that string, because I found when I put it down to the middle of the pile, it read the temperature, but then the leaves kind of go, and it's hard to find your thermometer again. So I put the string on it until I bought that composting thermometer that's in the box right there. Now that composting thermometer does the same thing that little thermometer does, but how long do you, just think of this. If you wanted to put it in chat, you can, but what is the length of that composting thermometer? And I guess this is like Jeopardy, so I don't have Jeopardy music, but it should be 18 inches. That's because it can reach the center of your pile without reaching your hand to the middle of the pile. So, I talked about the yardstick and the thermometers. Now I'm going to talk about the gardening spade there. Actually, that got willed to me by a family member. And if you notice, that is not a pitchfork. A pitchfork has round tines that are sharp. These may get a little sharp, but they are flat. The way I turn a pile is I walk around, and the way I build a pile is when I put those 6-3 water and mix, then I walk around the pile kind of like you're paddling a boat, and I mix each layer. Now, that also means on the back side towards that fence, I need room to put a lawnmower or walk where I could turn my pile. Now, why are my sandals there? My sandals are there to remind you you cannot put too much water, in my opinion, on this pile when you build it. Each layer needs to be well watered. And my story on that is when I first built my first pile, and my son was maybe a teen or right around being a teenager, he was not going to come out and hold the water hose for me. So my wife and I went out there, and she would do the water hose and I would do the turning. And I tell people that that helped my marriage because I was able to talk to my wife. So have somebody help you with the water, either that or you water and then turn the pile, turn the layers. You have enough water that water is going to be coming out, so wear something you don't mind getting wet. Build it up to 3 foot by 3 foot and walk away. Well, if you want to, measure the temperature in the middle, because it's going to be whatever those temperature of the water, the leaves, and the grass are. But it's like a bell curve. It starts heating up, and after the first day, it can make it to 130 degrees. And then it will get either hotter or stay about that. And then when you see it start going down, that's when those microorganisms have done their job with what they have. Maybe they need a little water, maybe they need a little more green. That's usually what I did. When that pile starts, temperature starts getting less. Hey, and if you have to, stick your hand in the middle of the pile, and if you have to pull that hand out, then you know it is still hot. So when it is starting to get cooler, I used to add a little green and add some water and turn the pile. Now, the first time I built a pile, it's flat on the top. It kind of, once those microorganisms had done their job, they, the pile kind of caves in on itself. And that's kind of a neat sight in itself, you know, because you built this pile and it was straight, and all of a sudden it's caving in because down in the middle of that pile, they're making compost. And that's a good thing. Okay. This is what I did with the kids. If you notice on the left center, that's a picture that I showed you earlier, and then I gave them some brown, green, and blue. Now you notice the brown and the green are bigger than the blue. So I would tell the kids, build the pile. So they would build the pile, glue the pieces on there, and then they took that home to their parents. Another thing I did is I took pieces that were either green, that's on the right picture, G for green, B for brown, or done. And they had to identify which one of these plates was which. And some of those are hard to see. But number 3, you could see a green leaf, so that'd be a green. Number 2, you could see that's a green blade of grass, so that would be a green. Number 6 and number 5 are pretty easy to tell that those are either grass that dried up or tree leaves that dried up. So those would be browns. And then I had the kids write up a presentation of how they would teach this. And that's an example of that down at the bottom. So it still comes down to carbon, nitrogen, brown and green, water, and air. What are some of these things? Leaves, chipped shrubs and tree trimmings, organic kitchen scraps, livestock manures. That is not family pet manures. I'll tell you why in a minute. I'm getting a little feedback, so I don't know why.
Maybe
Shredded.
somebody's mic is unmuted.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm
Yeah,
not getting it now.
Please, guys, can you please check your mics and mute yourself? Thank you.
Shredded papers can go in here, and grass clippings. As I said, most of my compost piles have been grass clippings and dried leaves. You avoid diseased plant materials, pet droppings, meat, fat, grease, oils, and bones, and dairy products. And when I first build a pile, I try to avoid weeds that may have seeds. Talked about turning the pile. And what it does is it refreshes the oxygen because you're kind of mixing oxygen in there, and it blends the material. So that's usually when I told you about the temperature. You know, if the state of Texas and the TCEQ had you mow your grass when it got 1 inch taller than what it was, we would be mowing our grass every 3 days. But we live in a world where it is not convenient for us to mow our grass every 3 days, so we mow it on the weekends. That's kind of the way of turning the pile. If you don't have time during the week, that temperature may go up and then start to come down. But when you go turn it, maybe on a weekend, then you're going to, that pile is going to heat up again, make a bell curve, and come back down. So that's when you should turn. Now, it may not be every Saturday, and that's why you may cold compost, or if you're on a 2-week vacation, you may cold compost till you get home. But if you're building the piles correctly, you should be able to get them to heat up again. When is compost ready? When you take some of the compost that looks like dark brown earth, it smells earthy, it no longer heats up after you turn it or water it, and it looks like a dark soil. And if you take some of it and squeeze it in your hand, it should sort of stay together and slowly come apart. You could still have some grass and leaves because that may have been the last stuff you put in there and there wasn't enough of it to get that compost. It's more compost than it is grass and leaves. Then I'll tell you how to take care of that stuff. You could use compost as a soil amendment. Even if you, I find when I make my own compost, it usually is enough for one bed or one flower bed or one vegetable bed or one set of plants. And it usually isn't enough as a top dressing for a lawn. Top dressing for a lawn means when you take a spreader or you take compost and spread it out with a whatever, a rake or whatever, and you just have a little, let's say a half an inch compost on your grass. You could use it as a potting mix. You could use it when you're mulching. It is good. It loosens up clay soils and it improves sandy soils. Sandy soils is just the opposite. Water goes through sand quickly. What this compost does is it slows down the water and acts like little sponges in the soil, in the sand, to slow down the water going through sand. Now, compost tea is usually taking some of this compost, and if you had a burlap bag, putting it in there and putting it in a trash can of water and then dipping out that water to water your plants. It's a good additive for your plants. Now, what I've talked about is the perfect world. Here are some of the problems, and these are really kind of the top problems. Either you're going to have too much water or too little water, or some of these say the pile is too small. Now, at some point in the chat, they are going to put some links. And this comes from an A&M document where these links are listed. On fire ants, that's the one thing I have gotten in my piles. And what I try first is turning the pile and then watering. That sometimes discourages them. Sometimes I've taken citrus oil and mixed it with water and put in there. They don't like that. But usually I don't put any chemicals in my pile. If I had to, I don't even put baits and low toxicity stuff around my piles. Sometimes I'll put it in my yard to take care of ants. Master gardeners have a program called the two-step where they talk about how to get rid of fire ants. So that's another question you could have for the Master Gardener hotline. Okay, let's talk about bins for a couple of minutes. Here's some of the things that I wrote down: piles, pallets, perforated garbage cans. I put that in here because one of the ladies builds her pile in a perforated garbage can, and then she has the kids roll it around the yard daily. Wire mesh. I've built wire mesh ones that you go buy at Lowe's or Home Depot. You just make a big enough circle to do your 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot, connect it together and build your pile. Molded plastic, brick, tumbler, or a trench. You could compost in the valley between your rows in a garden. If you dig that and put your stuff in there, especially kitchen scraps, and bury it deep enough where animals don't get it, or you can take those kitchen scraps and put them in a hole in the ground, or you could take those kitchen scraps and bury them in your compost pile, and they will be mixed around they will be mixed up the next time you turn your pile. So try to bury it deep enough. And also I do the clock method where I put a clothespin where I buried them so I remember where that was, so I don't bury more the same place the next time. Here's some samples of bins, some pictures, some drawings and pictures. The lower left was at, it's not there anymore, but it was at Lexington Park in Sugar Land. And unfortunately, when bins are out and not used, they become trash receptacles. And that's not a good thing. Here are some of the bins that were both at Lexington and at Master Gardener's Gardens in Rosenberg. Now, basically, you're trading that 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot, or in the case here, that shepherd's bin at the lower left. These manufacturers of these bins have figured out how to get the right aeration in there and build a bin and sell it to you. The one at the top right actually turns on there. So it would be good for an apartment where you were composting kitchen scraps. The one lower right is a big tumbler. Basically, what you're doing is you're trading your energy of turning a pile with a gardening spade or whatever. You're trading that for your turning this tumbler, but you build the pile the same way. Put some brown in there, put some green, water in there, and mix it. And same until you build the pile up. So it's a lot the same. Here's the top two are actually next to each other at Master Gardeners. And if you could, I don't know if you could tell, but the top left says cooking and cooking, and the top right says garden waste and ready to use. So what you do is when you build like that lower left one, you could build a 3-unit pile where you sort of build one, and then a month later you build another, and a month later you build another one. Then the first one's ready, and then the second one's ready, and then the third one's ready. As you could tell, the one on lower left, that's at Seabourn Creek Park in Rosenberg. And that became just a place for them to put limbs. Somebody wasn't following the compost, how to make compost rules. They were just following how to get rid of these limbs. Now, out by the two master gardener, those 4 bins at the top, between those 4 bins is their equipment for screening their compost. When you screen a compost, you put it through metal fencing, screening, hardware cloth, whatever it is, and then you shake it, kind of like what you've seen on a geologic dig. You screen it to where all the little stuff goes through and you use it, and all the big stuff goes back in the next pile. And the bottom right is just a sign at Master Gardeners saying wood chips, different things that go in a pile. And it kind of tells you whether they're green or brown. And that is a shepherd's bin, a cutaway shepherd's bin with its middle shepherd's bin piece in the middle. Now, as I said, I don't use that. But that could make the aeration of that pile work better, because you could fill it to the top, meaning 4 feet tall, and still do it. But mostly I build my piles to 3 foot tall. Okay, do we have any questions in the chat about soils or composting?
So the first question was about, she said she has put her clipped grass in the compost and she had a lot of weeds come up. And I think that you probably addressed with your hot composting.
Right. Hot composting will get rid of a lot of those. But if I know there's a lot of weeds, like if I mow the first time of the year, actually I send that one to the curb. And if I'm weed eating and I see a bunch of weeds, I'll rake that up and it goes to the curb. But after you get your yard to a regular cut where you aren't growing weed seeds, then you could put all that in your compost bin.
So the other question was, how do you collect, I'm sorry about that. How do you collect enough greens and browns to build a pile?
Okay.
3 by 3 without having some of it start to ferment.
Yeah, that I don't collect greens until I'm gonna build a pile. One time I was gonna build a pile at Lexington Park where they had those composters. And what I did is I knew that was a trash day. So as I drove there, I picked up the greens as I was going. And I already had browns saved because you could save those without them fermenting. So usually I could save browns, but I don't pick up greens until I'm ready to build or turn a pile. And a lot of times that was when I was mowing, and I would just, on those times, I would bag it in my lawnmower bag and take it over to the compost bin. So there was no storing of the greens. And if I built a pile and I wasn't mowing, I would look at my neighbors and say, who has a good yard? And I'm going to say this, that isn't synthetically fertilized by an outside company. I would take the yard waste from the yards that I see the way they do it, like on my cul-de-sac where I live now. And if the person's out there, I ask them if I could have them. If they aren't out there, they are out there for the trash. So I have stolen grass and I have stolen leaves from people. But I don't go to their door and ask them, but if I had a guy down the street that I trusted his yard, what he put on it, and I asked him the first time, if I see this out here, can I use it? He said yes. So that's the best world.
Good. So
Anything?
somebody's asking, can you use eggshells in your pile, and are these considered green?
They are considered green. They take a long time. I tried that the first time I built a pile, and it seemed like they never went away. Now, where I did use my eggshells a little bit better is in vermicomposting that I'm going to talk about here for a minute in a minute.
Okay. We have a few more questions. Let me get through this. So
Okay.
where can I buy earthworms commercially for my garden?
You know, then again, I would type in Tamu compost, and at some of their bottom of their literature, they will give a couple of companies that do that.
Okay.
Or TCEQ. I used to get a lot of stuff off TCEQ, but I've noticed they aren't as good as they used to be on finding stuff. But I don't even know if Master Gardeners keep track. I know Master Gardeners keep track of where they have bought them. There was a place called Rabbit Hill Farms. Now, but be aware that worms will not be sold reputably to you in the dead of summer, because they will come being worm stew instead of live worms.
Yeah.
So worms are things you usually get in not the hottest part, or you go get them somewhere. There's probably places in Houston that sell worms. And I'll go into that more in a second in the vermicomposting.
Okay. So if people make compost tea out of the compost, do they discard that other compost, or do they use it?
I'm the type person that I don't discard it. I just put it back on some place that not all the nutrients are going to be out of it. So
Okay.
I would say use it and see how it works. I mean, I usually don't discard a lot of stuff.
Yeah. And this question, I think the answer is in the question itself. Is it okay to use grass clippings of weed and feed treated to your compost pile? Yeah.
I'm going to say if you put weed and feed on your yard, then it would probably be okay to go in your compost pile. For years, I have not used weed and feed on my yard because it does damage to shrubs and trees. And I think that is a general master gardener kind of rule that I personally can't tell you everything behind it, but there's a chemical in weed and feed that deters trees and shrubs. So I would say yes, if that's what you got. And because that's what's on your yard anyway. But if I had a choice, I wouldn't put weed and feed. I wouldn't put weed and feed itself, especially on my pile, but I would sparingly use the grass from that.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And that's a personal opinion. I try not to use weed and feed.
Yeah, I don't either. There's how about coffee grounds? Coffee grounds are brown. Is that considered brown?
No, they're considered a green. There
Okay.
there are several things that aren't green that are considered green. Coffee grounds is one of those. At one time, Starbucks would bag up all their coffee grounds and you could go in there and get them. They go good on a garden and they go good in a compost pile.
Yes,
And my worms that I first built, they lived off coffee grounds for a year because that's what I fed them
nice.
from my work coffee grounds.
So I think this is probably one of the last questions before you get to Vermi, because we don't have much time left. Is how do you treat mold in the compost?
It depends on, let me say, mold. In my piles, they usually don't sit long enough to get mold. But in my containerized plants, such as citrus trees and things like that, when I repot them, I will see a white mold that isn't a bad thing. I would think if you had too much mold in your compost pile, that may be a moisture problem. But compost needs moisture. I don't know if there's a point where I would think there's a point where enough moisture is good, but too much moisture will cause molds and things like that to grow. But a lot of molds aren't bad. They're part of the process. If you went and dug in a forest, you would find you could find a white layer of mycelium growing underneath uh, underneath the ground. So I don't consider that mold, but I just want y'all to know there's things that grow underground that are good, and there are things that grow underground that aren't good. And I'm not good enough to know which ones they are without looking them up in a book.
Okay. Do you ever find a snake in your compost?
Once, but
Oh my God.
it wasn't my compost. Do you remember the compost pile I showed you that had weeds growing up in it? It was at the lower left of the that one, lower left. That one, the city workers had piled with not leaves. They had piled it with sticks, and it was full of sticks. And that is the only time I saw a harmless snake in the pile, and I let him be because he was just looking for the little mouse or roach or whatever else was living in there. If you hot compost, you are not going to have snakes in your pile. If you cold compost, you may have doodle bugs and little other kinds of decomposers that are going in there, but snakes are there not for the compost. They were there for the little mouse that was using that as his home because somebody put sticks in there and weren't making compost. So yes, at once that's kind of a disclaimer I say. Yeah, when I get asked that question, it was once because somebody wasn't composting, they were just piling sticks.
I think that's about the questions, and just maybe a minute for you to talk about vermicomposting.
It will only take, I got like 4 minutes, so that's okay.
Okay,
It
I'm going to
involves,
paste the links.
okay. Some of those links are for composting, and the bottom two, I think, were for vermicomposting.
Yeah, I already posted the composting once. Now I'll post the vermicompost.
Okay. So, vermicomposting, worm composting, paper and food scraps can be done indoors. I read when I first did this, they told me they love air conditioning, and that was true. I read just recently they love great air conditioning. They would love it to be 55 to 77 degrees. Now, mine were never that comfortable, I don't think. It takes up less space, it's less work, and it's a good way for composting paper. When I composted paper outside, it was a slow process. When I've done it inside with worms, it's done better. And worm compost is like the best things you could put in potted plants to make them grow. Which worms? Brown nose, red wigglers, or red worms. Do not use night crawlers that we have in our yard because they have different burrowing techniques, and night crawlers just don't do what we need done in vermicomposting. What you could do it in: wooden boxes, plastic bins, pre-made worm bins. My first worms were when I was about 15 years old. I wanted to capture the fishing worm market, so I ordered some worms, and I didn't know they weren't night crawlers and they were red wigglers. And I built some bins in the backyard in the ground, and they did okay, but they never get big. All these worms are about 1/3 the size of a night crawler. There are cities that do their whole composting with worms like this. Now, that bin there came from Mother Earth News, and is basically a bin sitting inside a bin. So you use paper, and for the most part, our paper manufacturers are good, and they don't use dyes that would hurt a worm bin. Food scraps. I used to put food scraps in my eggshells, would work, but they were slower. Coffee grounds, tea bags. They say some soil or fine sand. I never did that, but they seem to work. Leaves and other yard trimmings. I've never done that, and I like my worm bins mainly paper. You avoid the same things you avoided on composting.
The
So,
thing we give all compost people from our sweater.
so you tear the bedding on a piece of newspaper. I tear it from top to bottom where it's about an inch to 2 inch thick. I water it, and then I squeeze it all out. Wear gloves because your hands will get ink on them. Fill the container 1/3 full. Add your worms, approximately 1 pound for a 10-gallon bin. If you were doing this for a whole family, you may have a 10-gallon bin for each person in the family that you're putting kitchen scraps in. Mine has always just been demonstration garden bin. How do you harvest these? You push all the composting material to one side and put bedding on the other, and then you wait a while, then you take out the harvested composted material. Number 2 is put it on a tarp in the sunlight, and they go to the bottom of the little mounds that you make. And number 3, I find comical because I can't see doing this, but it was in the material: screen through a fine wire mesh. That doesn't sound like a way to preserve any worms. Maybe if you pulled a handful out, saw there was no worms in it and then screened it, I would go for that, but it just didn't make sense to me. Compost application for worm compost is about the same, just usually on a smaller scale. You know, if you're top dressing around a plant or something like that, or a potting mix or a soil builder, you could make a tea out of this compost, and it does very well also to water your, especially your potted plants with. Okay, here are all the compost links that you should see in the chat room. And unless I have some questions, which I don't mind, that's the last screen.
Okay, so if you have any questions, you can either put them in the chat or now you can unmute yourself and ask Ed.
There are, as I said, with Tamu, Googling Tamu composting, you'll see some links for kids composting where they're teaching kids how to compost. And it's a lot the same thing, just put on a level that they understand. And as I said, whenever I'm researching things for master gardeners, I start with Tamu, space, whatever I'm looking for, and to see what they do. One thing I usually check every year, I haven't checked yet, is there's usually a question about composting pecan leaves. And pecan leaves have like a tannin in them or a chemical in them that people have worried about it being composted. The last few times I've checked A&M on this, they said it's okay to compost pecan leaves.
I had a question.
Okay, go ahead.
I had a question about your opinion on commercial composters. I have a two-sided bin that is on a stand that allows me to rotate it. One side I put in the you know, the trimmings from potatoes, carrots, onions, and stuff like that. And then the other side, when it's full, I just leave it alone. And then I turn it every once in a while, and then I take it out when it's done and put it in a 5-gallon bucket and store it in the back until I'm ready to use it. What is your opinion on that?
My opinion is that I don't have, if somebody has built a composter, it usually allows a person to compost without having to turn a pile. You're trading your turning a pile exercise, you're turning the pile maintenance into something you could usually turn by hand. I have no problem. Once you learn how that composter works, which hopefully the manufacturer gave you some instructions, I have nothing against those. And that manufacturer hopefully has done the research how to make you successful in composting in that bin.
Yes, sir. I also keep two oval-shaped, sort of what you were talking about, rectangular, and mine are oval-shaped from chicken wire, and that's where I put my grass clippings. And I have chickens. I put in the chicken manure and scraps like that. I mean, the bedding from the chickens, and then I mulch my leaves. I have a Toro lawn blower, but it has the mulcher attachment, so I get the leaves real ground up fine in that. And I have two of those, and then when I'm ready for my gardening, I mix that along with my compost and work it in with a pitchfork and it seems to be okay. What do you think of that?
I'm going to say hats off to you because chicken bedding and chicken manure, the only thing about chicken manure is it's very hot. So you have to make sure it gets broken down enough into compost to be put on plants, especially if you're putting anything hot, meaning any manure. Try not to put it on young plants because it could be detrimental to that young plant. But if it's an established bin, I like everything you said. So it sounded good.
Well, I do appreciate it, and I learned a lot from your presentation. Thank you for it today.
You're welcome.
Okay, would anyone else like to comment or ask a question at this time? We have a lot of thank you for the presentation, so thank you so much for your time, Ed, and
You're
for sharing
welcome.
your information with us. It was very, very, very good. It was a great presentation as usual. Would anyone else like to leave a comment or ask a question at this time?
How
Oh,
are the chats recorded, or are they something that can be documented with the YouTube or anything like that?
well, let me go ahead and answer that question after I stop recording. So I'm
That's
going to go ahead
great.
and stop recording, everyone. Thank you very, very much for coming, and we really enjoyed having you. And I'm going to stop it now.